On this episode of Book Reports Podcast,
Wilford Brimley impressions.
Bryce and Sam are giant poo-poo heads.
Big Trouble in Little China is the greatest movie of all time.
JC hates Edgar Allan Poe.
Bryce needs to learn how to pronounce excerpt.
Hutu and Tutsis.
And much, much more.
Welcome to Book Reports Podcast, a podcast where I, a co-host and a guest, bring forward a book we've read in the past month for discussion, dissection, and sense of humor. I'm Sam Tyler.
I'm Bryce Teener.
I'm Josephat Reich.
Well, thanks a lot for coming along on the show, JC. That sounded like the ending of the podcast. Thanks a lot for coming on the show, JC.
See you next time, folks.
Splice it in later.
Yeah, you can leave now. Yes, Jehoshaphat Christopher Reich is back on the show. We're delighted to have him here. We had so much of a hue and cry from his last appearance, we couldn't help but bring him back on for more controversy. A couple weeks ago, JC sent us an email saying that, hey, you guys haven't had guests on for a couple episodes, and he arrogantly decided, you know what, you need me back on the show. So we are grateful to have you on again, JC.
This is an intervention.
You two are spending too much time alone together. I'm coming back on your show.
People are starting to talk.
Now, last time you were here was for the Halloween episode.
Yeah.
And we had a special interesting question. So you've never actually been asked the question we ask all our guests. What kinds of books do you enjoy reading, JC?
Oh, gosh. Enjoy reading. Probably the enjoy reading one would be like short little poetry books, because I can read like 5 pages and then I can feel like I've accomplished something and I can mull over that for a little while. It's really low effort. It's great. Other than that, probably nonfiction.
What sorts of nonfiction?
Oh, I definitely lean towards historical, international history especially.
Okay.
Yeah.
Canada's not international, okay? I mean, officially it is, but... No, I do want to ask you, going back to the poetry thing, since you said you enjoy it, do you enjoy Edgar Allan Poe and his poetry, or do you like his more short stories and mysteries?
And think carefully how you respond to this question, JC.
Well, Mr. Poe is a staple of modern literature who has lots of respect from established sources.
And has created the mystery genre
Exactly.
of detectives. Well, what I was going to say was, you know, he definitely gets darker after his love interest dies in real life. Mm-hmm. You get Annabel Lee, which is a famous poem of his. Definitely believe that he wrote The Raven afterwards. Whereas if you read more of his earlier work, it's more positive because he actually has a love interest. I assumed you were going to say yes, but then I was going to have a follow-up question of do you like his earlier work or later work? But since your answer is probably no, you don't like any of it.
Let's actually hear what your answer is to the original question this time.
I like some of his short stories, but I read them in 3rd grade, so I'd have to revisit them again.
Okay.
Yeah, his poetry, I don't like it.
Now, when you read Edgar Allan Poe's poetry, do you read them out loud?
No.
Oh, buddy,
No.
okay. I enjoy reading Edgar Allan Poe's poems out loud because the meter is really bouncy. So I personally enjoy his poems, but it makes me wonder, what don't you enjoy about the poems then?
It feels like I've read them by the time I'm halfway through.
Overexposure.
Yeah.
Okay.
I've read this. I feel like I know what the next stanza is going to be, the next meter. And it probably is partly overexposure, because when you're taught poetry, you're taught in the vein of Edgar Allan Poe. I mean, nobody introduces their kids to free verse.
For a reason.
Exactly.
For a good reason.
No one would enjoy poetry.
If you are exposing your children to free verse, child services will be getting
You're what's wrong with America.
From you, Mom. I learned it from watching you. But that's really interesting, man. That's very interesting.
You said you like his short stories.
Mm-hmm.
Telltale Heart?
Yeah.
That's probably one of my favorites of his.
I like The Pit and the Pendulum, too.
Personally a sucker for the case of M. Valdemar. That one's a really fun one. And Hop Frog is also wonderful.
It's a shame he didn't write any of the books we're going to talk about.
Next Halloween episode.
Oddly enough, the next book I was planning to read for this was an Edgar Allan Poe short story book. So maybe we've kind of destroyed that thought for now. We've already had it all out now.
We've jumped
It's
the
a
shark.
teaser. Yeah.
Tune in next episode
To hear this exact same conversation again.
with somebody else.
Actually, what is your opinion on The Raven? We kind of skipped over that, besides it being overtaught, certainly.
Seriously, that's pretty much what's ruined it for me. Like, we used it as a template for memorizing the macrolides in pharmacology. That's how overused The Raven is. It was the backdrop for a sketch teaching me about azithromycin, erythromycin, and its uses in combating chlamydia.
Oh, okay. Now you don't have to explain what that is.
Please go into more detail.
I do think The Raven is still pretty impressive for the rhyming scheme in it and the way the rhymings are used.
That is true. You just get stuck.
I will say this, The Simpsons in their first Treehouse of Horrors, which is season 2, James Earl Jones, read The Raven, and they kind of animated it. So, I mean, you get that nice James Earl Jones kind of The Raven.
Diabetes.
I'm Wilford Brimley. We're not recording this. Brimley reads The Raven.
Bryce, would you please?
Nevermore.
While I nodded near the night.
If you have a raven that lasts more than 4 hours, consult your doctor.
It's becoming Samuel Elliott.
The Raven.
Ravens.
Evermore.
For dinner tonight.
Since you're not a fan of his work, would you say that his real life, reading about that, is more interesting than reading his works?
Yes.
Because he had a very mysterious death. Even now that he's dead and in the ground, his grave is becoming famous because of people leaving things there on dark and foggy nights. And
things just kind of puts images in my head. Just leaving things.
Here's a Furby.
Here's a tickle me elbow.
And a magic bullet. I think they're just throwing their trash there now that I think about it.
Here's a ShamWow and a box of OxyClean.
And a broken sneaker.
Happy birthday, Edgar Allen Poe.
Still more than you had.
So they're just watching infomercials and thinking, you know who would like this?
Edgar Allen Poe.
Through the entire course of our podcast, we've picked books that aren't necessarily in the main fringe of popularity. We've picked books that just interest us that aren't necessarily ones that you would find on the bestsellers list of a Barnes & Noble.
I think so. I think I tend to do stuff from library book sales, and you tend to just pick stuff that picks your interest.
I would say the most famous book that we've done so far is our Harry Potter special. So I wanted to pick a book this month, probably the most famous book other than Harry Potter that we've picked. And so I have chosen Fahrenheit 451. And I didn't tell JC just so I could get his reaction on microphone. So that was for nothing.
I'm
really
glad.
Most of the books in Fahrenheit 451.
I went out on a limb here and assumed that you've already read it.
Yep.
And I assumed that it would be a book that you probably enjoyed.
I did.
I think discussing with you, you haven't read it, but you do enjoy, you're kind of on the fence with Ray Bradbury, right?
This is an interesting moment of shame for me, honestly, because it is a book I know I certainly should have read. I mean, if you had picked just about any other Ray Bradbury book, I would have read it. I've read a bunch of Ray Bradbury.
Well, hopefully after my book report, you'll be interested in reading it.
It's classic science fiction.
Right.
It's an important literary work. Oh, Bryce read it, but Sam hasn't. This is really great for Sam.
What world is this? This is one of those books that's always on the 100 books you need to read before you die sort of thing. And it's always listed with To Kill a Mockingbird or Don Quixote. All these famous... Did I say that wrong?
No, you said it right. I'm just thinking about putting that on a list of books you have to read before you die.
I mean, technically, you can take it off your list, though. It's 840 pages long, and after the first 200, it's just old.
I've seen the Wishbone episode. I'm pretty sure I know what
You're sad. That's what I meant when I said I read Fahrenheit 451. And by the way, I also saw that Wishbone episode.
Wow, that must be a dark episode of Wishbone.
He puts on this little fireman hat, and then he just grabs a sparkler and runs through the public library.
That's adorable. Honestly, I think that's our main competition right now, is old episodes of Wishbone.
If you're not learning it here, it's from PBS in the 90s.
So Fahrenheit 451 is written by Ray Bradbury. The book follows a guy named Guy Montag. He is a fireman, but now in this future, firemen are people that actually burn books versus put out fires. All the homes are actually encased in a fireproof plastic. And so if your home is found to have had books of any kind in it, these firemen will be called. They will burn your entire house to the ground, and all that's going to be left is this plastic shell that was your home, just because you had books inside. The idea is that books cause you to think things that are different from what society would like you to think, and so they want to get rid of books. Everything is about getting things done fast, doing things quickly. The whole entertainment system is just your entire wall is projections of people laughing or crying, and that's all their drama. There's really no plot to anything. It's just other people's faces and reactions. They're people eating a cake. That's what you watched last night.
Isn't that real now, though? There are people who is it Korea where they have the paid eaters, where people just watching people eat food. They do it so well that it's the entertainment.
I do have an excerpt. I'm going to get that word right one of these days. I have an excerpt.
You said it right this time.
No, not in my head.
Oh, where it matters.
I'm going to have confidence in saying
Pronunciation starts in the mind,
or else
Sam.
I'm going to find a synonym and never use that word again.
I'm going to use an extract.
There you go.
Sample.
Guy Montag, we find out quickly, actually has a few books of his own. It is believed that he actually has the very last copy of the Bible in North America. His fire chief, whose last name is Beatty, he is actually very cultured. And the further you read the book, the more he's like quoting poetry, the more he's quoting these classic works of literature to combat Montag as he is fighting over, what to do with these books. Should I read them? Should I not? And so Beatty says, everyone gets to this point. Every fireman gets to this point where he's just curious what's in these books. So take the book home tonight, read as much of it as you want, and then bring it back tomorrow and we'll burn it. And so he does just that. Beatty comes back and is like, see, there's nothing special about these books. I'll read this one excerpt. Give the people contest they will win by remembering the words to the most popular songs or the names of state capitals or how much corn Iowa grew last year. Cram them full of non-combustible data. Choke them so damn full of facts they feel stuffed, but absolutely brilliant with information. They'll feel they're thinking. They'll get a sense of motion without moving. And they'll be happy because facts of that sort don't change. Don't give them any slippery stuff like philosophy or sociology to tie things up. That way lies melancholy. Any man who can take a TV wall apart and put it back together again, and most men can nowadays, is happier than any man who tries to slide rule, measure, and equate the universe, which just won't be measured or equated without making man feel bestial and lonely. I know I've tried it. To hell with it. Even though it was written in the 1950s, it does seem that it's able to predict some part of our future. I was like, oh my gosh. Some of the most popular shows today are pretty much all singing shows or dating shows. There's really nothing of substance to them.
I think you're right. The second half is true, but I do think the first half of that is flipped around today. Because of the rampant use of the internet, we have access to these facts, but we have access to too many facts where we really can't know anything because we have so many facts and only a few of them are true. The first half of that statement has been flipped on its head so much, it's the exact opposite problem now in some ways. He's right, though. I mean, he is absolutely right that is something that we still have today. And certainly the second half absolutely applies, though. It is easy for entertainment to just go back to being just raw emotion and it just being bread and circuses effectively.
There's this really popular quote floating around the internet basically talking about how we're presented with different dystopias. On the one hand, we have Fahrenheit 451, 1984, other books with numbers in them, and their version of dystopia is the government's going to take everything from you. It's going to clamp down versus, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, which is the government's not going to worry about clamping down on anything. It's going to flood you with centrifugal bumblebee and just overwhelm you with sensation to where you can't focus on anything. And it's probably a fair bit of both because, like you said, we've got tons of stuff on the internet, no way of knowing what's true and what's not. But I mean, at the same time, if you want some really sensitive data, like, say, the Panama Papers, folks could end up dead.
Well, I think you're right. I think if you look at the dystopias, the government has to give something when they take something for them to work. Like in 1984, where you have the enemy that's given to everybody to have the hate minute every day? Mm-hmm. That kind of thing, where they have certain things that can be a distraction for everybody to have. Actually, what is the system of government? Is it militaristic at all, or?
There is a war going on, so there's constantly jets flying over. You don't really hear where they're having the war, though.
Oh, Oceania, then.
Yes.
And so, you get this idea that there is a war going on, but we're winning. We're always doing great. That's what the news is always saying. We're doing great. We're winning the war. I'll explain the title now. Fahrenheit 451 is supposedly around the temperature that paper actually burns. And so I wanted to look it up just to be sure, because there's actually a range. It's anywhere between like 448 to up to
30 degrees. Things are always combusting around here.
So it's like 448 all the way up to like 457. The older a book is, the lower its temperature gets. And so the older books tend to burn
It's igniting
quicker.
point?
Yeah, it's ignition point. I don't know that he actually meant to do that as a metaphor, but it's kind of like a good metaphor for the book that, these older books that made you think are probably the books that first went up in flames. They didn't actually specify which books were first being burned. I like to think that's the way it worked was, they got rid of the older books that actually made you think differently, that actually made you have an individuality outside of society. Should I give you the ending of the book?
I feel like you can.
I think it's been around long enough that if you really wanted to not have it spoiled.
So, spoiler alerts. Montag, he starts definitely changing his thinking. He actually sets his captain, Beatty, on fire after Beatty caught him with the books, and he made him burn down his own house with a flamethrower. And so he sets Beatty on fire, knocks out the other firemen, kills what's called the Hound, which is this metal dog, chases after people that if they try to run away, it pretty much just kills you. And so he runs to this professor's house that he has become friends with. He trusts. And so what he does is he strips all of his fireman clothes off. He puts on the professor's clothing and douses himself in like whiskey just to lose his scent because these hounds can find him based on scent. And so when he crosses the river out of the city, he meets up with these outlander people who don't want to be part of that society, but also each person memorizes a book, and then we burn the book, so that we can pass on by word of mouth to future generations. We see that the city is then strafed with bombers and destroyed, and then these outliers with Montag try to move back into the city to see what they can find. And that's how the book ends. He said in the afterword, too, he didn't realize the irony that Montag is a paper company.
Oh, that's fun.
And he didn't mean to do that. One of the fun things that he found out later.
Now, you also read this book, JC.
Mm-hmm.
Did you enjoy it?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things it has going for it is it's a nice, short, easy read. You can probably nail it down in 2-3 hours. I like this book in parallel with Brave New World.
Interesting, okay.
Yeah, just because it has so many parallel themes and such a parallel plot, you know?
Like information control, or what are you thinking?
Like I said, they're kind of the reverse. One's information flooding, the other's information control. But, you know, this protagonist who's uncertain of things.
Oh, okay. A part of the machine and wants to leave. Okay,
right.
That makes
sense. Then falls in league with the machine, and then, surprise! The leader of the machine's actually against the machine. Part where they separate is, you know, the protagonist, the noble savage in Brave New World, ends up hanging from a ceiling fan. This one's happy.
Which oddly enough, you spoiled in the last episode.
I was going to say, you mentioned Brave New World in the last episode you were here.
Gosh darn, why do we keep talking?
It is your favorite book, apparently.
I think it is your favorite book. Now, being that this is Ray Bradbury, there's one thing Ray Bradbury is very well known for. It's his wistful, poetic prose style. What did you feel about his style of writing?
I assumed that this book was going to be banned from like libraries and things, so I went to the Wikipedia page to read about it. And there are a few libraries throughout the country over the years that have banned the book. They talked about the symbolism on the Wikipedia page as well. The phoenix is one of their symbols. That, like, this vehicle is called a salamander.
Oh, okay.
They set things on fire. And so that's a symbol on like their helmets and stuff, but there's a phoenix on their chest. Several references to setting yourself on fire and kind of being reborn. You get that symbolism too of him changing his clothes at the end and going across the river, which is a very, like, coming out of water kind of rebirth is a very symbolic too. And so there's definitely a lot of symbolism that, you know, once I read that it's there, I was like, oh yeah, it is there.
Okay. How about you, JC? What are your feelings on Ray Bradbury's style?
I thought it flowed pretty well. It was a pretty easy read. Kind of like a young adult's fiction book, which, I mean, to be honest, sometimes it's nice how little processing power they require. You can just, like, follow the story.
And I will say, I did go into this book assuming that it was going to be difficult to read because it was on that list of books, because it's held up to these other loftier books. 60 pages in, I was like, this really isn't that hard.
That is one of the neat things about Ray Bradbury is that he is a very accessible author when it comes to his style, but it does still stand up to really close reading of, oh, look at the images, look at what he's comparing it to. Is there anything you guys didn't like about this book?
Probably the happy ending.
That is something I was kind of considering too. The dystopian trilogy of Fahrenheit, Brave New World, and 1984. Only one of them has a happy ending, arguably. How would you have preferred the book ended?
There's no reason for it to end happily.
Interesting.
Now, here's the thing, though. I wouldn't say that it actually ended happily. Because the story ends with the city that he lived in being bombed. He's with this group of people that are only going into a burnt out city, but we don't actually get if the rest of the United States is burned out, if they are destroyed.
But at the same time, I don't think you can say Ray Bradbury's point of view is that those were things worth saving.
Like there's hope. There's ashes
it's
to grow
hopefully,
from.
not hapfully. It's hopefully.
Yeah.
So like a phoenix, they have to rise from the ashes.
Yeah.
Because the other two, there's nowhere to go from there. Like,
right. Once you've had rats strapped to your face, there's nowhere left to go but down.
Exactly. Like, 1984 arguably has the worst ending because what's killed there isn't the body but the spirit.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, that's true.
Brave New World, you have a dead guy. At least he went out with his morals.
Guns a-blazing.
Exactly. Yeah. And in this one, I mean, you've got a happy ending, but the thing is, it's controlled by an external factor, the war. But the thing is, the war didn't even have to exist because part of the argument, I'd say, of those books is that the existence of war isn't necessary for there to be an actual conflict. War is used as a control. You know, Eisenhower's warning about the military-industrial complex.
Right.
So the war didn't need to they didn't need to lose the war. So we're like 25% probability now.
Arguably, granted, having not read this book, I could be completely... I'm going to make a supposition about a book I haven't read, guys. Get ready for this fan headcanon. It could be that the war isn't real. Does any part of this book take place on the battlefront? So it could be that they have to have a certain amount of destruction in order to keep the sense of there being a war going on, maybe.
So 451 was an inside job.
Jet fuel can't melt books, guys. It can't melt books.
I will say one thing I didn't like was I like when it's chopped up into chapters.
Oh.
There are 3 chapters in this book, and there's like 200 pages. I kind of like either have to stop where a conversation ends, just because it just keeps going, and then it's hard to like pick up later. Whereas get to the end of the chapter, it's the end of an idea. So I always like books with chapters. This one only had 3. But when that's the only criticism I can give to this book, I mean, I'm nitpicking at that.
Well, I'm not reading it now. I'll tell you that.
3 chapters. That's 3 reasons not to read it. So, JC, what book did you bring to share with us today?
Well, bring is a strong word. I brought it in my head, kind of like one of those 451 dudes.
So you didn't actually read anything, did you?
I read it.
He's going to invent a book out of his own mind right now.
I read
Timmy the Tractor and the Tyrannosaurus. Yeah.
Actually, it's Bryce and Sam are giant poo-poo heads.
Yes!
Oh, man. But no, I actually lost my book bar hopping. I'm working on it. I was a little inebriated. It's hard to keep up. But no, I mean...
Guys, and this is really a public service announcement at this point, never ever drink and read. Please read responsibly.
Yeah.
What book was it?
It was The Zapatistas Reader by Tom Hayden.
Zapatistas?
That
sounds like a delicious
Zapatistas, everybody! Zapatistas!
I think I got that as an appetizer.
No.
What'd you get? I got the Zapatistas. What did you get?
That's my favorite flavor of Uncle Ben, really. That's the best one, the Zapatistas.
No. So the Zapatistas were also known as the EZLN, Ejército Zapatista Nacional de Liberación.
Oh, so something worse.
Please, JC, we're all familiar with the LNDO.
Yeah, you don't have to tell me.
Come on. Who do you think you're talking to here? Come on.
Sorry, who's the book by again?
Tom Hayden. He was liberal Californian Democratic senator, and that tells you all you need to know about him, really.
Wow.
He passed from us recently. So the Zapatistas were a rebellion that started in 1994 in the southern state of Chiapas in Mexico. So they started largely with indigenous base.
Indigenous bays?
Indigenous base. As near as we can tell, the timeline of advance...
So non-Spanish Mexicans.
Yes. So as near as we can tell, the timeline was sometime in the early 90s. A couple of radical Marxist students left university, went out to the indigenous hinterlands, and wanted to recruit these indigenous farmers and natives in order to bring them into the proletariat and start part of the worldwide insurrection, which was all of the rage at the time. During this process, there were 3 students, and basically the indigenous were like, proletariat what? They were...
Good put down. Good put down, indigenous farmers.
So basically 2 out of the 3 were like, yeah, let's get out of here. And then the third one was like, actually, no, these guys might be interesting. They might have a point. So he stayed behind, and he became known as Subcomandante Marcos of the Zapatistas. So, these guys got their military start in 1994 with an armed uprising on the night of the passage of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. The way it was affecting Chiapas is these guys were all indigenous local farmers. They didn't really have a huge thing for the cash economy. They were subsistence farming. They had their land. And since Mexico's independence almost 100 years ago, they had been getting the shaft one after the other because things went to the white landowners. Nobody respected the fact that they owned land in common. Things were getting diced, and they were promised land reforms, and that never happened. And then here comes NAFTA, which they viewed as a death sentence because a lot of them grew coffee. While there were trade barriers in place, that was enough for them to keep on going. Once we lowered those trade barriers and they competed with Mexico in coffee and also, even more importantly, corn, they weren't able to really keep their lifestyles going. It was abject poverty. In 1994, when NAFTA passed, they started an armed insurrection and killed 40 white guards, which was the term they used for the hired guns who protected the white landowners.
Right.
And protected might be a little bit of a benign word because they would also go out and acquire land by killing indigenous peoples. So, 1994 was when they were like, okay, this is it. We're going to do something. Since then, the Zapatistas are actually still going. They actually joined the electoral process, and I think came away with like 1% of the vote as a minority party.
Hey, that's a place to begin.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. Unfortunately, not exactly what they wanted, but they've had a really interesting journey. Starting in 1994, from then on, you get this robust dialogue between the Zapatistas, the Mexican government, and more importantly, the Mexican people and the people at large. This was an interesting revolution because, except for those 40s who were killed on the initial night, they haven't really killed anybody else. They have certainly been killed. They live in the jungle and, they're trying to avoid the government. But I tend to distrust revolutions because, you look at every revolution throughout history pretty much. The French Revolution, the American Revolution. Typically what happens is all you do is flip layers. And it was interesting to see the Zapatistas acknowledge that. Subcomandante Marcos is both military commander and their spokesperson. He's not in charge, even though lots of people thought he was. He went to great pains to point out, I'm only a subcomandante, I am not commandant. The decision-making rested with an indigenous council. Actors from Europe, from the States, everywhere, they booked tours through this military-occupied area in Chiapas to go visit the Zapatistas.
Where are you vacationing this year? Oh, I'm just going to go see the Zapatistas with my dad. Yeah.
That was actually exactly what happened. They held rallies, and international revolutionaries from all over came, and the Mexican government was like, we'd love to kill these guys, but it would look really bad.
But in Spanish. Can I just say how impressed I am? You don't have your book, and you're getting these names, what I assume is correct. I can't even get Ray Bradbury right. It's on the front of my book.
Well, he did say the leader of the Zapatistas was Arnold Palmer, so I'm pretty sure he's just making these names
Sub-Arnold Palmer, weren't you?
Sub-Arnold Palmer.
Really making stuff up is just par for the course.
Zapatistas?
Zapatistas. They took the name from Emilio Zapata.
I was wondering about that, yeah.
Yeah, so Emilio Zapata.
I thought it was him, yeah.
I was wondering,
no
did
idea
they get
who
the
that
name
is.
from Zapata? Okay.
Right. So he was an earlier revolutionary.
Another revolution.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you said they're still going on today.
Yeah.
Are they still in the jungle, even though they're a political party?
They've kind of emerged. When this book was written, the Zapatista Reader, which was a collection of primary source documents, largely written by Subcomandante Marcos, some were speeches by the Commandant when they came to Mexico City in 2002, and others were external pieces written by magazine editors or other prominent intellectuals like Octavio Paz.
So as a reader, this is literally not a reader about them, but a reader by them.
Both. Because like I said, there were third parties like Octavio Paz and other prominent intellectuals who wrote articles about them. But the majority of the writing in this book was by Subcomandante Marcos, which, like I said, he was both the military and the PR arm of this group. And
fun combination.
It really was. And his personality was, in a lot of ways, just as important as the political movement that the EZLN was founded on. Because one, like I said, if it wasn't for them constantly attracting international attention, it would have been far easier to kill them. They probably wouldn't have got to this point.
It seems to me that, like, in the past few years, we've seen a lot of the communist, right?
Yeah.
Getting that right? Okay, make sure.
Well...
socialist?
No.
What do we call them?
Indigenous. Indigenous is probably the best way to describe them. Because even though the original three organizers came in with a communist ideology, remember, two of them left because they felt like the indigenous peoples weren't getting on board with it.
Anti-imperialism, I guess?
Yeah, they define themselves as anti-neoliberal. So two of the things that they keep asking for and keep saying they're important is, one, that they want to be recognized. That they want people to know they exist. That they don't want to be just discarded and consigned to el olvidado, oblivion. And then the other one they keep saying is we want a world in which many worlds exist. We do not want one world in which everyone is forced to conform to this mold.
Interesting. That's pretty good.
Yeah.
I can get behind that one.
Yeah. And the other thing that I really like about them, because like I said, it's easy to distrust revolutions.
Right.
One is that they openly acknowledge that most revolutions just serve to swap the layers of society. They don't change its fundamental thing.
Right.
And Subcomandante Marcos says the military is a necessary tool for revolution, but it cannot impose a new order because militaries are things which necessarily just shift layers of society. We won't be able to keep that going.
Well, I guess then I'll just call them revolutionaries then. In recent years, we've seen most of the revolutionaries in South America are either imprisoned in mass numbers or being turned over and being able to be reintegrated with the society of their governments. We saw that in Colombia fairly recently. We're seeing that in a couple different places. If this group is as popular and as basically celebrities as they sound to be, is there any integration with the Mexican government at all? I mean, if they participate in an election, I gotta assume there's some.
Now there is. When this book was written, they adamantly refused it because they saw it as a ploy from the government to essentially assimilate them.
Right.
To put on a show of listening, but actually listen. And the government had definitely been guilty of that in the past. Go figure. They would promise one thing and then modify it a little bit later under the table. Yeah, now they've got a minority party. They still wear their masks. They still retreat to the jungle, but there's a little more integration.
Sorry, wear masks. Can we please... 'Cause it's Mexico. I have to assume they're luchadors. Can you please back up on... It's not V for Vendetta, is it?
No.
Come on.
Not.
Okay, good.
It's just a black cloth draped across the plate.
Okay.
And pretty much every member would wear it. Interestingly, with Subcomandante Marcos, the PR guy, he never took his off. Ever.
That's... Okay.
Yeah.
Emblematic.
He's got awful acne.
But actually, I would say this is a little more V for Vendetta type. One of the reasons for not taking off the mask was so everyone could be Subcomandante Marcos.
Like, would you say there's a connection between, Spartacus and his rebellion and what's going on here?
Yeah.
Any gladiators in this one by any chance?
No.
Any leather thongs?
Oh, I see what you mean, though. You're talking about the I'm Spartacus being the everyman.
Right.
The Spartacus, despite being the leader, was still considering himself as still one of the slaves that were rebelling, as opposed to being in charge. At least according to the Kurt Russell movie. Not Kurt Russell. Kirk Douglas. Kurt Russell's a very different person.
I know who neither of these people are.
Have you not seen Big Trouble in Little China?
Nope.
Okay, along with Muppet Treasure Island, those are the greatest movies ever made.
Okay, now I actually do have to watch it.
This is the most fun you can possibly have in a dumb action movie that knows it's a dumb action movie and is just having fun being a dumb action movie. It is a delightful movie that you do not take seriously whatsoever. It's just a ball of joy. It's got a main hero who is completely incompetent and doesn't do anything well during the whole movie. It's really amazing. And I don't remember how we got here.
So, I wanted to ask you, how did you discover this book? I've never even heard of these people. I didn't know anything about this revolution. If you didn't talk to me about it, I still wouldn't know. So
I still don't know about it.
Yeah.
He spoke in Spanish at the time.
I was actually visiting Cornell with my ex, and we stopped by a used bookstore. There was a section on international history, and I was like, oh, this looks interesting. I just looked it up again to make sure I got the author's name right and everything. I found out I overpaid by like $10. You can get this online used for like $2. I think I paid like $15.
Oh.
Well,
but you paid for the experience.
Exactly.
Well, and to be fair, I would also say the real joy of a used bookstore is the price, but it's also half of finding books you don't know about.
Right.
True.
You're not going to a used bookstore with a shopping list. Like if you go to Barnes & Noble, you're getting the top 50 books of whatever category, but you're not getting the really fun, interesting books.
Mm-hmm.
Was there anything you didn't like about the book?
Oh, gosh. Probably that it tilted a little too heavily towards the writings of Subcomandant Marcos.
His perspective too much?
Don't get me wrong. He was important. He was the PR arm. But certain scenes kind of repeated themselves after a while.
Okay.
And the other thing is... Oh, gosh. I'm really ripping on this Tom Hayden guy. But the thing was, he wrote introductory summaries to every piece. And I quickly learned after reading the first two, if you plan on actually reading what follows, skip them because they add nothing to it. Now, if this was a textbook, it's 480 pages long or something. If you had to read it for class, that would be super useful. It would be amazing. It would save your bacon.
He's not giving perspective or commentary. He's giving a summation.
I think he's trying to give perspective, which makes it worse. Yeah.
Well, in that case, what is your perspective that you have gleaned on the movement?
So... One, I think the person is just as important as the movement. This persona that was created and established by Marcos. Even though he started out as a communist, he became heavily influenced by the indigenous, who were also heavily influenced by liberation theologians. And I have a huge affinity for liberation theology, so I like that, because its entire discourse is on how do the powerful dispossess themselves of power for the benefit of the powerless, which is arguably the hardest, most unnatural thing to do. The importance of the disavowal of using the military to govern if they came into power. So one of the things that really made me concerned early in the book was within the first 100 pages, they gave an account of the armed revolution against the White Guards. And one of the revolutionaries goes on records as saying about the White Guards they killed, no son gente, no son personas. They are not good people. They are not people. And that's the seed from which all of our genocides spring. And whether or not you came from a powerless position or a powerful position, I mean, the Hutu and the Tutsi, one of the best examples we have.
Can we just please have an episode where the Hutu and the Tutsi don't come up, JC? Why you gotta keep bringing that old racehorse in here?
12 episodes in a row now.
Come on.
Do I really?
No.
Oh, okay.
Please tell us about the
We
Hutu
have
and the
never
Tutsi.
said those words.
Oh, gosh. Okay, because, I like to trot them out a lot because they're such a good example of what happens in revolutions. So, the Hutu and the Tutsi. So this was Rwanda. The Tutsi are this tall group of pastoralists who make their livelihood off of wandering around with cows. 10% of the population. The Hutu are this group of shorter Bantu-derived people who live off the land. Britain's like, hey, we own everything, including you guys. And they're like, ooh, tall people, not many of you. You guys must be the nobility. Let's put you in charge. So they put them in charge over the Hutu, and things are going great for the Tutsi. For many years, they accrue lots of power, they persecute the Hutu, and then the British took their hands off, and the Hutu were like, hey, you know what? 9 of us, 1 of you, massacre. So the Hutu had genuine reasons to be aggrieved. They were not the initial aggressors. However, they quickly became that. People are fickle. We like to kill each other. So
Book Reports podcast. We like to kill each other. So guys, it's been a while since I did an espionage book, and so I decided to break down and cover one of my favorite espionage fiction authors, John le Carré, this month.
You're breaking out. John le Carré?
Yeah, John le Carré, which is the pseudonym for, I think it's David Cornwell is his actual name. There's a reason he goes by John le Carré. When he wrote his first novel, he was working for the British Foreign Services, and they have a policy that if you're going to write a book, you have to use a pseudonym. So he had to come up with a name. And he came up with...
Couldn't you just pick your boss's name? And
Le Carré is French for the square. So his pseudonym is John the Square. But John le Carré is one of my favorite spy fiction authors, most famous for writing Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, which I'm sure everybody has at least seen the movie or has seen the amazing Alec Guinness BBC short miniseries. This is a collection of the first 5 novels John le Carré wrote. It was really fun for me to go back and see his early work and to really kind of
dive into that. That is as thick as a family Bible.
It's only like 800 pages. What was really fun for me was to see the early work and to see the early ideas and how quickly his style just manifested on the page. You can see a little bit of a progression in him getting better and better. The first novel that he wrote is Call for the Dead, which is a murder mystery. But this is the story that introduces his famous protagonist, George Smiley. And George Smiley is a sad little man. He's the kind of person that if you were to see him in a store, you would assume he is looking for something, but he's clearly gone to the wrong store for it. He's a pudgy little man. He wears ill-fitting clothes. He wears thick glasses. He's a sad sack of a man that you look at him and you feel sorry for him. He is also a brilliant and ruthless spy master and the best interrogator in Britain. He is a genius when it comes to tradecraft. His tradecraft is the skills you use to be a spy, basically, knowing how to make contact with people, how to work your assets in foreign countries, that kind of thing. He's a master of that. He is a brilliant, brilliant spy master. In his first story, Call for the Dead, George Smiley is working for MI6, which is...
Their CIA.
Yeah, exactly. Though in John le Carré's work, he refers to it as the circus. And he has been called in because they had an anonymous tip that somebody working for the British Foreign Service used to belong to the Communist Party. Now, these books were all written in the 60s, so this is very much the Cold War spy thrillers. He goes to interview this man, and it turns out this guy was a member of the Communist Party, but he's perfectly fine, so he says, we're not even going to bother following this up. You're fine. Don't worry about it at all. That man then is found having committed suicide a day later. And so George Smiley is on the hook for, what did you say to this guy? What did you do to this man that he committed suicide a day later? He's like, I did nothing. So he goes to check in and he talks to his wife and he says, my husband was very upset about talking to you. He just came home in an absolute state of just absolute anxiety. That's probably why he killed himself. And while George Smiley is there, the telephone rings, and George Smiley figures, well, maybe it's my office trying to get in contact with me. So he picks it up, and it is a wake-up call left by somebody in the house for the next morning. And it turns out the man who killed himself left a wake-up call for the next morning for some particular reason. And he uses his spycraft, he uses his ability to be able to look at details and discern people's ability to be able to lie to him and to figure out what is actually going on and why did this man die. And it's a really good novel. It's a very strong beginning. George Smiley is a wonderful protagonist. He is such a great protagonist that John le Carré stopped writing him because he became too iconic. I can't keep writing this guy. The pressure is too hard. Just get rid of him. That's Call for the Dead, which is the first novel he wrote. The second one is A Murder of Quality. This one is pretty much just a straightforward murder story, which is, it was okay. It was okay. Basically, a woman sends a letter to a Christian newspaper saying that her husband is going to kill her, and the editor in charge of the Christian newspaper used to work with George Smiley back during World War II.
Was their advice, pray about it?
Yes, it was. Yes, it was, Bryce.
Wait, really?
No. No, they didn't send her advice because she died too suddenly. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, male.
The head of the Christian newspaper calls in George Smiley to go take a look in at it and see what's going on. That one was okay. I think John le Carré is at his best when he's writing spy fiction because he did work in MI6. He did all these things. When he's actually doing spy work and writing spy fiction, that catches my interest, and I think it's him at his best.
Did MI6 have to greenlight all of his, did he have to go through them with his books? Because I know, for instance, recently James Comey, the former director of the FBI, wrote a book, and he had to give the book to the FBI and let them read through to make sure he wasn't actually giving any national secrets away. Did he have to do the same thing with MI6?
Honestly, I'm not really sure. You're absolutely right. Most, especially in Britain, because Britain has the Official Secrets Act, which basically means if you tell people anything, you're ours. I'm not really sure what his process was. Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy is basically about Kim Philby, the biggest mole in English history. It's a fictionalized version of it. Yeah. So I don't know how hard he was vetted, or did anybody just say, yeah, it's John le Carré, don't worry about it. I'm not really sure. That's a really good question. I don't know. His works are really accurate. The next book in this, The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, was written as a response to how popular James Bond was. Basically, John le Carré said, well, if you enjoy spy fiction, I'll give you spy fiction, son. This is the hardest, most brutal, most bureaucratic, most realistic view of the spy world up to that point in time being written. And John le Carré is giving the details of how awful it is to be a spy and how hard it is to be a spy and just how messed up you have to be and how messed up it makes you to live in this world. But Spy Who Came In From the Cold, honestly, is the novel I would most recommend from this collection. It is fantastically awful.
That means a spy who was out on assignment and now has come back, right? Like when you're out on the cold, that means you're out on your own, you're out in the field doing your job.
And they can't come and help you. So yeah, a spy who comes in from the cold is somebody who's back in their native country, not on assignment, basically. Yeah, that's right. You get a gold star. Yay. On the espionage board.
But I can't tell anyone about it.
Yeah, it's a secret gold star. But that's what this book is about. A spy comes back from an assignment. He is a handler for his agents in East Germany. And so he's running people behind the Iron Curtain. And his last agent is scooped up by East German police. And so he comes back to Britain and he is devastated. All his work is going for nothing. And there's one guy whose name is Munt, who is in charge of the East German police force, who has just somehow come in and scooped up all of his agents that he built relationships with that were relying on him to keep them safe behind the Iron Curtain. And they're all just gone now. And so his overseer comes in to this man, whose name is Leamus, and says, Leamus, you hate this guy. Do you want to be his downfall? And Leamus says, yes. Leamus basically becomes an alcoholic on purpose and does his job poorly, and he gets transferred over to research, but he's basically being a librarian for them, and he just kind of devolves, and he lets his life fall apart on purpose, and eventually he assaults a greengrocer, a grocery man, and he is put in prison. After he's put in prison, East German intelligence agents come and recruit him, because he's a spy who has fallen apart and is disillusioned with what's going on, and so he goes back to East Germany to bring down Munt.
Oh, that's cool.
Well,
it's a neat process.
Without giving away the ending, part of the fun of this book was the realization of what's really going on. And when you realize it, it's like, oh, that's awful. That's awful. Oh, I can't keep reading this. Let's read it. It's a really great book. It's designed to be an anti-James Bond book. The whole idea of how awful it is to be a spy and what you have to do to be able to be a spy and the kind of life that you're forced to live.
Different woman every night.
I hate that.
Martinis left and right.
When Spy Came In From the Cold was released, readers in Great Britain loved it because they saw Leamus as a tragic hero. This is a spy for our generation. This is the downfall of this great, courageous man. And John le Carré goes, no. That is not what this book is about. You know what? I'm going to go write another one. And so he wrote The Looking Glass War.
Out of spite?
Completely out of spite. Which is the most heartbreaking, most tragic spy book I've ever read. The basic
Is that included in this one?
Yes. These are the
novel?
5.
Okay.
Sounds good.
This one is not my favorite, but it's a close second. The plot of this book, it's a department in Great Britain that used to be the Army's Intelligence Bureau. And they used to have spies in World War II that would go out and do missions abroad and have radio operators in every country sending signals back to Great Britain. And they used to have a really, really exciting old days. But as MI6 has gained importance, their budget's gotten smaller and smaller and their personnel has gotten smaller, where they're basically just a research wing. They're not doing any operations at all. One of the guys gets a tip that there's a possibility that East Germany is building up missiles within striking distance of Great Britain. And so this book is this poor, sad department's attempts to be able to corroborate this information and to be able to get that one shining moment of glory that will bring them back up to being what they used to be in World War II. And this story begins with my favorite thing in this entire book. The carrying of a very heavy weight, such as a large suitcase or trunk, immediately before sending practice renders the muscles of the forearm, wrist, and fingers too insensitive to produce good Morse. And that is a quote from F. Tate's complete Morse instructor, Pittman. And so it begins with that little quote about if you're a Morse operator trying to send a message, don't carry anything heavy right before it because it's going to cramp your fingers and it's going to take you a while to be able to do that. So you have that in the back of your head as you're reading this book of why is this fact important? And when it happens, it's just, oh, there it is. Oh, no. And that's the eventual downfall of this entire operation.
His hand cramps up?
It's his hand. His hand gets tired from carrying something heavy. The whole tone of this book, it's not a tragedy because at no point in time do we really want the characters to win. Like, it's obvious from the start they're going to fail. Like, this is a book of errors. Boy, these guys are making a lot of security mistakes. Why is he giving a different name than what's on his passport? That's a stupid thing. What if they check that? And it's just all these errors. Their tradecraft is terrible. They are awful. And they keep making mistake after mistake after mistake. And there aren't really heroes in this story, and there aren't really villains, but if there is a villain, it's my favorite character, George Smiley, because he's the guy who's working for the competent spy agency who's kind of hovering around going, what are they doing? Oh, they shouldn't do that. That's going to be a failure right there.
That sounds like Infinity War.
I haven't seen that. Is it?
It's a lot like what you're describing. Like, oh my gosh, why are you all so stupid? Wow, you suck at this.
And that, honestly, that could be the back title of Looking Glass War. I mean, it is a story all about people who are looking back in the past at their glory days and wanting to recapture that and just not being able to. People who just are not good at their jobs, but are trying so hard. And remember, this is all not to stop the missiles from being launched, but to corroborate whether or not there are even missiles.
Right.
It is just a story about failure on failure on failure. And it was really good. It's such a heartbreak of a book, but it was really, really terrific.
So out of the 5, which one was your favorite?
Oh, it's definitely Biocumen from the Cold. I think that's the real amazing one. And it certainly isn't the last book in the entire series, which is A Small Town in Germany. It takes place in Bonn, which after Germany was cracked in half, Bonn became the capital of West Germany, because remember, Berlin can't be the capital because there's two sections of it. And Bonn was a fairly small town that just kind of suddenly became the capital of the entire country. So it kind of deals with the troubles of Bonn becoming so important and some of the interesting problems you run into where you need to come up with a bureaucracy to run a country, but everybody who's good at that used to be Nazis. Basically, a man who works at the British embassy in Bonn disappears. And at the same time he disappears, a whole bunch of important files go missing too. And this one was okay, but there was no George Smiley in it, which gives it an automatic deduction of 10 points for me because I love George Smiley so much. But it was okay. It was okay. It wasn't as good as The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, because that's just such a thrilling gut punch of a story. It's just such a brutal 150 pages. It was a really, really great story. And Looking Glass War after it is sort of the long, drawn-out tension of, we know this guy is going to set off the alarm. We know this guy is going to fail. We know these people can't do this. Where are they going to fail? And how are they going to get caught?
2 questions.
Yeah.
Are these available in audiobook? And am I allowed to listen to them in audiobook?
It depends on who's reading them.
Okay.
No, I'm sure it's fine. Boy, if you can get somebody with a really great British accent, yeah, I would say these would be good, worth audiobooks. Actually, that might be a better way of reading A Small Town in Germany, my least favorite one, because the majority of Small Town in Germany are interrogation scenes where one guy is trying to get people to tell him what he wants. And that was a little boring, I felt, on the page. Like, John le Carré is good at that stuff, but after 6 or 7, I kind of started going, okay, let's get something happening. Okay, because the majority of the book is interrogation scenes. And that I think would work better in an audio format. That might actually be a rare case of this would make a better audiobook than a book. Which I'm surprised I didn't burst into flame saying that.
I mean,
honestly.
between this and you recommending to read Edgar Allan Poe out loud, I'm a little worried that you've been spied out and you're not Sam. I mean, Bryce's book is like 100 pages. Mine was Lost in a Bar, and yours has 5 novels.
All Wikipedia something for this episode? Because I looked up John le Carré on
I looked
Wikipedia.
up my guy.
Yeah.
All right.
Hey, research, everybody. Research.
I
still missed. Yes!
We did it.
This is why nerds don't do cheerleading.
That was the worst high-five ever. I couldn't concentrate on both of you at the same time. I had to choose one or the other.
Here, an inch apart, and then we'll go.
I still missed.
The lamest one possible.
Where is
That was
this one?
the point!
I'm sorry.
Are we going for lame?
Yeah, research high five. I can only do one. I'm inadequate as a man.
If it sounds pathetic, it's what we're aiming for.
I want to thank our special guest today, JC. Thanks for coming back. Thanks for rejoining us
Absolutely.
after the trauma of the last episode.
And I'm still sending you my bill.
Yes, thank you so much for coming back, Daisy. It was great to be able to have the deep end discussion and all the ridiculous silliness.
For listeners out there, you can find us online because, I mean, how did you get this copy otherwise?
Pirating, I bet. Don't you feel bad about yourself?
And then printed it out on paper, a physical copy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Do you realize how much money you're stealing from us that we'd be making otherwise on this show if you weren't pirating it? Come on.
For free. Because it's on YouTube and SoundCloud and iTunes. You can subscribe to us on all three of those places. You can like us on Facebook, facebook.com/bookreportspodcast. You can email us, bookreportspodcast@gmail.com. And you can find Sam on his blog at skullduggeryinthesmoke.blogspot.com. Our theme song, The Show Must Be Go by Kevin MacLeod, can be found on incompetech.com. I'm Bryce Diener.
I'm Sam Tyler.
I'm Emilio Zapata, risen from the dead.
And we'll see you next episode.
Viva la revolucion!
Basta ya. On this episode of Book Reports Podcast.
There you go. That's better.
Like you didn't just record an episode with us.
Yeah.
Be excited.
Yeah. Try to have the enthusiasm you have going in, not the desperate hopelessness you have going out. That's important.
Sleepy though.